Let's Talk podcast guests are invited to share their unique perspectives regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. The ideas expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the practices of Mesquite ISD and are not an endorsement of any particular agenda or viewpoint.
Welcome to the Let's Talk podcast, inspired by Mesquite ISD's leadership and empowerment team, or LET for short.
Our guests include educators, students, and community members sharing their experiences from their perspectives.
So let's have a real conversation about embracing our differences and finding common ground with our hosts, Dr. LaDonna Gully and Ted Madden.
In November, a friend of mine recommended the podcast History That Doesn't Suck, and I dove in. To date, there are 93 episodes, each about an hour long. Lucky for me, I was more than 3 years behind, so I listened almost every day for 6 months and caught up. I learned, and more importantly, retained more history in those 6 months than I did throughout my life as a student. Host and creator Greg Jackson, who is a professor of history at Utah Valley University, has a new podcast every 2 weeks. Episode 1 featured a 22-year-old George Washington and his first battle in 1755. And the latest episode was about the Statue of Liberty, which was completed in 1886. So we still have a long way to go to get to where we are today. Professor Jackson is fluent in French, nearly fluent in Spanish, and he can affect countless accents when he quotes historical figures. He composed and performed the music used in the introduction of his podcast, and I just learned he's training for a half marathon. I know there's more, and I'll let him fill in the blanks when he introduces himself. As you can tell, I'm very excited about this episode, so let's get to it. My name is Ted Madden. I work for the district's communications department as a video producer, and I'm a 48-year-old white man.
My name is Dr. LaDonna Gully. I am the Director over Leadership Empowerment for our district, and I am a 51-year-old African-American woman.
Well, I'm Dr. Greg Jackson, and I think, Ted, you've more than covered it. I have nothing more to add, so...
I don't believe that, but I appreciate your humility.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So why don't we start out with, tell us about yourself.
Oh, geez.
And how did you land with this wonderful podcast?
Sure. So I have a bachelor's degree in history, a master's in French studies, and my PhD is in history. My dissertation was, this always kind of throws people off since the podcast is, of course, U.S. history, but my dissertation was on Muslims in France in the interwar period between World War I and World War II. So a lot of military history comes in there, as that first migration wave was largely driven by World War I. I got hired on at UVU, Utah Valley University, as a lecturer, and then ended up getting tenure track shortly thereafter. And 2017, I remember thinking and seeing in my mind an insufficient reach from trained historian academy into the public sphere. And I'm always a little cautious when I say this, because I always then get some historian who raises their hackles. I published in the Atlantic, and I'm proud of you. Good job. Taken away from that. It's not that that doesn't happen, but in particular, as podcasts have become increasingly popular, scratching my head and thinking, and this is with no disrespect to those who are already in that space and who they are and what they do, but kind of thinking it's sort of ridiculous that there are very few history that are taking on, teaching and talking about history in this very public place. We tend to publish articles and books that can, someone probably feels like I'm attacking them. I don't mean it. These are valuable books and articles, but they could be a bit esoteric or jargon heavy, harder for people to reach. And in my mind, I wanted to make rigorously researched history simply more accessible, not something that you have to be available in the middle of the day. So you've now got the luxury of not having to work. Typically, these are people who've just graduated high school, right? The traditional, if you will, college student. But what about someone who has a mortgage and and, they spend their day doing maybe even a very intellectual job, but they're rusty on their history. They haven't set foot in a college classroom in 20 years. What about someone who doesn't have the privilege of even going to college? And for me, I think understanding our history, is crucial to, and I'm really just riffing off many of the founding fathers when I say this. You can't have a successful representative government if you don't know your history. That's a part of civics. And I don't think that we value that enough as a whole to ensure that people are able to, be as prepared as possible to fully participate and succeed, and feel as they, are American citizens in this great republic of ours. So these are all, it's not like I single-handedly thought I'm going to make sure everyone knows their civics per se, but these are the different things that were coming at me. Just only that it's just ridiculous with the internet being what it is. We should make this more accessible. And there are these good positive externalities that come from a better educated citizenry. So I foolishly stepped that space, and it has, taken on a life of its own. I, in my wildest, sure, I would have thought, yeah, it'd be great if it becomes a national sensation of some sort. You don't actually think those things are going to happen, though. And, here we are 3.5, coming up on 4 years later, and well, it's taken over my research entirely. The book on French history is indefinitely on hold. I'll circle back to that someday, I think.
All right. So all modesty aside, then, how popular is your podcast? How much reach has it had?
It's I don't go into exact numbers. I'm reaching 6 digits, unique listeners, mostly in the United States. I'll give you some percentages. 96% of listeners are American. That doesn't surprise me in the least bit. It is fun to see, a few thousand Canadians listening, a few thousand, Brits. Germany's got a decent following. Australia is perhaps that colonial history with Britain. I don't know, but Australia's got a decent fan base. So. Yeah, I mean, it's been wild, and yeah, here we are.
Yeah. So talk to me about why you think your podcast is so important, but why is history so important?
Well, there is the old saying that, of course, gets thrown around in these situations. It's cliche, but it's true. The idea that if you don't study your history, you're doomed to repeat it, or as historians like to often joke, those who study history are doomed to watch everyone as they still repeat it nonetheless. But in all seriousness, we are, as I often think of this, we are the same beautiful and ugly and brilliant and stupid and generous and evil species that we have been for centuries, at least since history begins. We get pre-writing and then we start calling it archaeology. But I don't think that we have significantly evolved, in the last few thousand years to say that we can't learn something from even ancient Rome. We're the same species. So if you want to have a decent indicator of what on that bell curve of humanity, what a society is going to do, not exact individual, but the society as a whole. Well, you got to look at previous societies and see what did they do in situation A. Well, guess what we're probably going to do if situation A arises yet again? You can give someone a smartphone that doesn't change, what we are genetically deep down inside. So, those same stress responses and fear responses and insider, outsider, inclinations, the tribalism, or the capacity to overcome these things, that is consistent.
Wow. A couple of overarching things I've learned from listening to your podcast. We've always been divisive as a country, and we're always fighting wars with someone. So I want to start with the divisiveness. when you know as little history as I did before I dove into your podcast, you assume, or I assumed, that the founding fathers were all on the same team. We called them all the founding fathers. So give us a sense of the different factions that have always existed.
Sure. You know, this is, and if I can set this up in a macro situation, we always look at out, and I would argue that when you history, even your own nation's history, you are looking at an outside group. It's a foreign world. The United States of the 1780s, if you went back there magically, you know, you time traveled, you got the Doc's DeLorean and made it back there, you would find that you really don't fit in. You know, the culture is going to be is as foreign as if you took your passport today and went to another country. So when you look at an outside group, you tend to cohesiveness. You know, Europe, we'll throw that term around here in the United States, the Middle East, and we act like these are cohesive places. And sure, there can be some sort of broad cohesion. I'm not trying to take away from that entirely, but when you're a part of a group, and all of us have experienced this on some level, it might be your religion, it could be, being a dance mom, for crying out loud. You know, there are divisions and rivalries and personalities that sow problems. So the founding fathers, as I like to joke in the classroom, and I've probably said in an episode or two, it gets harder to remember every word I've said, you know, nearly 100 episodes in, but about the only thing that they agreed upon is that George III, the King of England, was a terrible human being. And that doesn't make him objectively right, but that's just, you know, they agreed on that. And mostly, you still can't even say entirely, mostly George Washington, pretty awesome. Other than that, disagree on almost anything you can think of. Now, the major two factions, though, to get to the heart of your question, Ted, we have the Democratic Republicans. And by the way, I'm just fast forwarding to the early republic, because we could talk about all sorts of other divisions just founding the nation. So the Democratic Republicans, who are more inclined to think about the Articles of Confederation and the conception of the colonies before they became states, which is that they were independent and sovereign. So that's another fallacious thing that we often we lose track of, is that, well, they were all British colonies, right? So they were kind of one the same. No, it's almost, if you think about today, Canada is an independent and sovereign nation from the UK, but they share a sovereign. Very similarly, you know, Virginia was Virginia, and Patrick Henry hated the US Constitution because he did not like, we're going to start stitching these states together in some sort of, you know, sovereign giving, meaningful way. No thanks. He was no fan whatsoever. And that's where Rhode Island, they wouldn't even send representatives to the Philly convention. They weren't going to step into that mess. So, you know, we've got the Democratic Republicans who are kind of these, we basically lost the fight on the Constitution, but, you know, now we got to politically engage, and here we go. This is very much going to be the states' rights group. More inclined to say, you know, that the state should be making as many decisions as possible. Then you got the Federalists, who are, you know, we need each other bad. And the fascinating thing to me is, if you look at which founding fathers are in which group, it speaks to their experiences. So George Washington is technically not in either group, but, you know, we all kind of know he's sort of a secret Federalist. Just, you know, don't tell Thomas Jefferson, who suspects it anyway. And his experience was seeing a weak Congress that couldn't raise taxes, because that is, right, separate sovereign. The states can raise taxes. We're going to kind of voluntarily send money to Congress. And guess what? That works about as well as having a group of 20 people go out to dinner and say, we'll split the check at the end. Somehow it comes up short, even when there's the one generous person who paid double, right? So, you know, we've got those who saw the lack of cohesion, and they tended to have been in the Continental Army. Alexander Hamilton, right there with George, they don't even have shoes or shirts for our guys. And then you've got those like, say, Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't physically in the trenches, governor of Virginia. I mean, he saw a few things here and there, but it's a very different experience. And so for him, he's not seeing the necessity of things being tied closer together. He's seeing the drawbacks that are going to come with it, because of course there's always ups and downs, right? And so just any other era of history in any nation, if you're trying to understand why does someone have a view, well, look at where they're coming from, right? They're probably blind to the advantages of the other side's position, and they're perhaps even blind at how that other side is even suffering. And so when we study, to kind of even circle back to the first question, I'm sorry, I know I can be chatty.
We've listened to your podcast, we know.
But it again shows the importance of studying history, because if you can start to see, oh, okay, well, maybe Hamilton wasn't a terrible person, maybe Jefferson, his ideas also had some validity, but they just couldn't see each other's views. I mean, heaven forbid, we maybe pause and think perhaps that happens in our lifetimes as well. Just throw that out there.
So, the other thing that I took away from the podcast, or I've been taking away, is wars, whether it's the British, the French, the Spanish, the Mexicans, the Native Americans, each other. We've always been fighting, and that doesn't even get into the 20th and 21st centuries yet. So why are we always at war?
So this, I'll harken back to, what I was saying about the same species, right? That we are. And my observation is that under certain conditions, you can just count on humanity being ready to kill each other. And those conditions, again, they've been present in the world pretty much in perpetuity. And, before I even get into those, Ted, let me point out, you're mentioning how we are constantly at war. And this is a shock to you, because if I may, I would suggest you've grown up American in the United States, at least as far as I know. Forgive me if you actually immigrated here from Germany 30 years ago or something.
No, you're right.
Somehow missed that.
American
Okay.
mutt. Yeah.
Okay. You and me both. So, when you're on the inside, you're less inclined to notice the violence, the wars in your history. But we're really good at noticing all the violence and wars in other nations' histories. So, sometimes I'll get students who come in and, so one of my sub areas is the Middle East. So I'll teach courses on that. And so I'll have some students that are under the impression, very innocently and unintentionally, it's not like, they're trying to throw shade on the region. They've been told that the Middle East has been at war with itself more or less for 2,000 years. Just it's always at war. And no, it's just as inclined to go to war as we are. And it's had phases of peace and prosperity, when Europe didn't, and vice versa. So all that to say, we're just that, we're kind of programmed that way. And so we need to look at our history and see what is it that makes us, tick and go in that direction. And one of them is disputed land. So now think about the birth of the United States. It's born in an era where indigenous peoples, their population has dramatically dropped since the arrival of Columbus and the spread of European diseases. So they're a weaker force. And of course, they're not united either. That's another big misnomer that people seem to think is this big blanket term of Native Americans, like they were one big nation. They were no more united than the French and the Germans. And, up until the European Union, those two groups, they did not play nice. So, the Americas from North and South was kind of seen by Europe as up for grabs. And as that colonization played out, when you have disputed land, when someone gets control of it, but they don't really, right? It's on paper that they're claiming it. You're going to have more war. Because we could conversely point out that the largest unmanned border that's peaceful in the world is the United States and Canada. Well, so what's the difference? How come we're not trying to go to war with Canada now, but in the 19th century, Canada was basically born in fear of the United States. It was truly terrified that stronger broken off, no longer part of the British Empire nation, come up and snatch their turf, overrun them. Well, the border disputes settled. And once those settle, you don't really have people in, say, the state of Washington, or I bet we could snag that. I bet we could get that. British Columbia is looking nice. I would like to farm that. Because it's just been so settled. So, that's what kind of takes us through the 19th century as almost like water being poured into, just poured out into the streets. And you can see that water just splash everywhere as it goes to its lowest point. That's kind of what happened as technology took off and Europe kind of descends on the Americas, because you'd see a lot of the same story if we talked about what's going on with Spanish colonization down in South America. So I'll shut up at that point, but there you go.
No, very good point. But I wanted to go back to something that you said a little earlier. Why is it that we don't like to look at ourselves and really evaluate who we are, where we are, and make really better, I guess, possibly make better decisions? Why is that so hard for us to look at our history and say, you know what, and look at the good, bad, and the ugly, call it what it is, and be able to move forward?
That is an excellent question. And I've had to make peace with the fact that I'm programmed a little differently, because I do like to do that. And I've come to appreciate that that's not a super shared trait, throughout society. And the thing that I've landed on is that any given nation, society, they all do this. The French, which again I've studied quite a bit, they're really good at kind of overlooking that whole French colonial empire, in certain regards. It's always amused me when I'm talking to skiing counterparts and they want to say something about the United States, and sometimes it turns into some fun, witty banter, to be honest. And I go, oh, okay, my British friend, sure. You really want to go down this road? Because we can go down this road. It's a part of who we are as a species. And I think you can even see it on the individual level. People do not enjoy being told that they're wrong. It takes real, genuine humility to go, okay, it's that. I am so sorry. And it can make people feel insecure. Or even just look at people's social media, right? You don't have people posting, man, I applied for a job and it didn't work out. Just want you all to know, I'm just being real with you. No, they're going to post when they get the job, right? And we as a society kind of do the same thing. And I will say that for, all the discussions that are even happening in our present, and those can be tough. I also look at some other nations right now where they are not even open to discussing, hey, maybe we need to acknowledge some difficult things in our history. And, I don't say that to say like, we're good. I want the United States to keep doing better. I feel like we do sometimes almost get dejected because we're not moving where we want to be quick enough. And I guess I would just kind of remind people, hey, we're getting better, I think. I feel like the history that people know today seems to be a bit better than it was when I was going to high school. And it's my hope that, we'll keep chugging along and we'll get there. But yeah, it's a trait that you're going to find everywhere. And so if you realize that that's a very human thing to do, I have to better be able to counter it when we know these barriers are going to go up. How do we get those barriers to come down?
Mm-hmm. So I always get on LaDonna about this because she says we, and I keep telling her there is no we anymore, at least not right now, and probably never has been. And so whenever we say, how do we move forward as a society? How do we do something? We can't, because we're not together. But that's just kind of an aside. What I really wanted to ask you, this country obviously has a long history of prejudice against African Americans, beginning with their importation and enslavement, and even continuing after slavery was abolished. And after listening to your podcast and also the podcast 1865, which is a brilliant audio drama, I can't help but wonder what life would be like for African Americans today had Reconstruction continued under Abraham Lincoln instead of Andrew Johnson. And as an addition, does that make John Wilkes Booth the most successful assassin of all time? Because this is exactly what he wanted.
That's an excellent question. And the first thing that comes to my mind as you ask that is there are two individuals in history that I think are worth noting who both thought that Reconstruction would have turned out better for their individual groups within America had Abraham Lincoln survived. Frederick Douglass, Jefferson Davis. Both of them said things would have been far better. Frederick Douglass obviously speaking about African Americans, Jefferson Davis speaking about white Southerners. So a few different ways to think about that, or at least two different ways. One, of course, is simple romanticization, right? That Lincoln, he's killed at the peak moment. I mean, the Civil War has just ended. He is at hero status and he's assassinated. It makes him a martyr. And I don't say that to take away from him. Lincoln is one of my favorite presidents, but it does set you up for immortality in a rather positive way by and large. But I also think that both of them may have been right. Not one right. I think both of them might have been right. Because as I think about Lincoln, in my mind, he really did the impossible in as much as any human can. Somehow, he managed to lead the United States through this Civil War. He, he called on us in his second address weeks before his death to answer to. He simultaneously pointed out we need to recognize 250 years of enslavement for African Americans, while calling on us to respond to the better angels of our nature. He was able to keep these two perspectives in mind that certainly aren't mutual, and yet they tend to be portrayed that way in 1860s America. So I do think that they were probably both right. I feel like Lincoln could have ushered a Reconstruction that, just like the war effort, probably would have frustrated radical Republicans, probably would have yet had greater staying power and real meaningful change than that bomb that happened under Johnson. So does that make him the most successful assassin? I'm not sure. I think that could be a good argument. I also think maybe Charles Guiteau, who kills President Garfield, I put him up there. Garfield is the finest that we did not get to really have. And he had frankly, I feel like he was ready to basically resurrect in some ways Reconstruction. Now, again, it's easy to romanticize Garfield because we didn't get him, right? Just like it's easy to romanticize what would have happened under Lincoln in Reconstruction. But an important thing that Garfield had for him that Lincoln didn't is that the fatigue of war, and even the moral fatigue, which for us, we look back on 1870s America, and we want to scream at them, right? You want to shake them and say, why couldn't you get Reconstruction right? You messed us up for generations. And Lincoln, I think, had a really tough road ahead of him, because as we also do in our narrative is we follow that everyone in the North was anti-slavery. We lose sight of the fact that once you've got a large number of Northerners who are going, great, the war's over, the Union's together. And to be very blunt, a lot of white Northerners saying, and who happens to African Americans in the South? And I know that is not fun to say or think about, but that was the reality.
Yeah.
So Lincoln had to deal with that moral fatigue where people are, that's what really is the radical Republicans do not have the purchase. They do not have the pull with American society. They don't have the majority to really say, no, we are going to see this thing through. You've got Republicans who are just like, yeah, great if things are a little bit better in the South, but it's time to just let the South do whatever it's going to do, which of course is going to mean Jim Crow and, well, we don't have time we'll leave it at Jim Crow. So I feel at this somewhat rebounded later period, he might have been able to kind of pick up the ball off the field and run with it a little bit more than Lincoln even could have. And Guiteau ended that.
Well, and I must tell you that what a great conversation, right? We actually could go move on just from that and just talk. But you have mentioned in your podcast, you've talked a lot about the difference between assimilation and acceptance. And we have even had some discussion here in our podcast where we've talked about what's the difference and how has it really worked in not only our community, but in our society overall. What are some examples? Can you share maybe a couple of the examples that you've used in your podcast to really talk about it, and how has it worked, and possibly how hasn't it?
I'll tell you, this is actually a question I mull over a little bit more than it's a harder question for me, perhaps because I think so much about this big nation that in a sappy way I very much love, and I want to see greater unity in it. I think it's ironic and interesting that it's often in the name of assimilation that, frankly, assimilation doesn't happen. One of the better ways to actually create a cohesive group is to not try and press and cohere group into conformity, if you will. I think we also lose sight of how, to return to my point that 1780s America is a very different America than today. We want to feel like we've got this perfect little line that connects us, that we aren't evolving, that, I don't know, it gives us some sort of sense of somehow being closer to them. And I don't think it has to take away from that. But think about so many things that we consider so deeply American that didn't exist in Washington's era. You can even do that with the, if you will, more quote unquote acceptable European immigrants. St. Patrick's Day wasn't a thing. The Irish were not terribly welcome. How many of us are putting up Christmas trees as we celebrate Sinterklaas, thanks to, German immigrants who aren't going to show up until a century after Washington? And yet these are quintessential American things today. I juxtapose perhaps the German experience to the experience that many other groups have had here in the United States, whether we're talking about ethnic groups, where we talk about indigenous nations, or we talk about what African Americans have experienced. On the religious front, I'm podcasting to you from Utah. There's a very specific reason why they exist and is what it is, one thing, I guess, when you think about this very question, obviously I'm closer on the ground to Utah, and I've got my pulse on it here a bit more. And my ancestors were among those who walked across the country as a result of things that went down in Missouri and Illinois. And I'm amused when I see things happen in the nation, and they then look at some senators or congressional reps, whether they're from Utah or not, they tend to be, but they come from a Mormon background, and they scratch their heads and say, but these guys are conservative. How come they like religious refugees? How come they're good with that? And we lose sight of, some of the trauma and the things that happen to different groups, they have ripple effects. So I guess all I'm saying at the end is that if America wants to be a more cohesive family, just like with our family, don't try and force your children to do A, B, or C. Having greater love and trying to have understanding and calling in is far more effective at creating some sort of shared bond than focusing on our differences and trying to berate a group for not fitting in an A, B, or C. That's my 2 cents.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems obvious when this question does, if I ask you about the future of the podcast History That Doesn't Suck, I mean, you just take it all the way till you finally catch up with present day and then you write your book?
Well, people ask me about this a lot. What I can tell you is that I am undeterred in continuing on my path to somewhere in the late 20th century. I am not going to go up to present day. Some people, they ask about that. They want to hear my take on the 21st century. And I'm not saying I'm indefinitely opposed to that, but I want to be a historian. I don't want to be a pundit. Right. So I feel like there's a cutoff point where you have to say this is still a little too hot in terms of having good historical analysis. Not saying that someone shouldn't analyze it or that it shouldn't be discussed in the public sphere, but it just shifts. We no longer have a good historical perspective. It's, now we're doing play-by-play. A historian is more like Ted, if I can maybe step into your world a little bit, which I have no business doing, but it's more like the coach watching the tape after the game with the players and going, oh, here's some things that we could have done better. And these are things to keep in mind in the future. Whereas, the commentator, as the game is being played, that's what I don't want to cross that line as much as I can avoid. It gets hard to do that with history because there isn't a clean point. But my inclination right now is to say probably, I'm certainly going through the Cold War, but I'm not sure about the Clinton years, and I'm definitely not going past 9/11. No question. That'll be the latest I go.
Well, I have to say thank you so much for what you do, because History That Doesn't Suck is an amazing podcast. I have learned, like Ted, so much from just listening, things I did not know, people I did not know that was not taught in the history books. And I think that that's why it's so not only relative, but it also helps me. You don't have to do a play-by-play when you listen to it, because you're like, oh, well, that makes sense for why we are doing this or why this is happening. And so you really help me just as a listener to connect the why. So why are things like, I'm like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense because of this, what's going on right here, what's going on right now. So thank you so much for that.
Hey, my pleasure. Glad I'm living up to the bar that I set, which isn't terribly high. All I said is it wouldn't suck. I didn't say it'd be great, so.
True. That's true.
I say you come up with that name? Because I love that.
So it's actually the first name that I came up with. And I spent 3 or 4 thinking there's gotta be something better than that. And I circled back to it. I mean, part of it is just kind of who I am. I mean, I am a highly trained academic and all that jazz. At the end of the day, though, I'm also still that skater/surfer from the Los Angeles area. I've never been one for kind of airs, if you will. And I feel like that is just one of the barriers that perhaps unintentionally, but in the jargon that academics use to speak quickly to each other, we lose the public. So I just wanted to articulate, kind of the tone even. That, you'll hear words like suck. I do try to keep it not explicit, but I want you to feel like we're just having a casual chat. Even if I am going to hit you with really rigorous history, it's going to feel casual.
Well, it does. It feels very casual, easy to understand, and definitely relevant.
Thank you.
And I say, LaDonna knows, I say this a lot on this podcast with our guests, and I mean it every time, but we could continue this conversation indefinitely, and LaDonna and I would never get bored. So we appreciate you joining us and providing your perspective and especially your expertise.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's really been a great time.
This podcast is History That Doesn't Suck, and we can't recommend it enough. As per our podcast, you can join the conversation by emailing us questions or topics at letstalk@mesquiteisd.org. Or you can reach us via social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by using the search term LetMISD. For Dr. LaDonna Gully, for Dr. Greg Jackson, I'm Ted Madden. Let's talk again next week.